China's barter for oil program in Iran, why it matters. Commentary. At a meeting in Beijing late last month, China's maneuvering was familiar. Foreign Minister Wang Yi sat across from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Secretary-General, spoke of solidarity in the Global South, and framed China as a partner that respects sovereignty. Out in the Gulf, the approach was markedly different. A U.S. carrier strike group was moving toward the region as Washington warned Tehran over a violent crackdown and the risk of renewed escalation. Inside Iran, protests that began in late December were met with a deadly response, mass detentions, and disruptions to communications, enough to trigger emergency attention from the United Nations and repeated calls to halt the violence and restore access. This is the gap worth watching, China's stabilizer messaging, and the quieter systems Beijing is helping Iran build underneath the smoke. What Beijing leaves out in its narrative. When Iran's clampdown on protesters reached the UN Security Council, the familiar Beijing line reappeared: resist external interference, keep the matter framed as internal, and lower the temperature. In the Council's Iran session, China and Russia leaned into restraint and diplomacy while pushing back on US threats. That posture is not just branding. It protects Chinese interests. Analysts at Brookings put it bluntly: Beijing's priority is stability, both to preserve access to Iranian oil flows and to avoid a chaotic outcome that empowers actors aligned with Washington. But stability, in this telling, is carefully packaged. Beijing is not offering troops or promising a security umbrella. Chinese leader Xi Jinping isn't creating a formal alliance structure around Tehran, because doing so would convert a useful, sanction-buffered partner into a liability that might drag China into a regional war. Instead, the Chinese Communist Party is stabilizing something narrower: the regime's ability to function, pay its bills, and protect itself from the kinds of disruptions that have made Iran look brittle. Oil as the quiet currency. If you want to understand the CCP's leverage in Iran's crisis, start with who gets paid and how. The U.S. Energy Information Administration's latest SHIP Act report estimates Iran exported roughly 1.44 million barrels per day of crude and condensate to China in 2024, nearly the entirety of Iran's seaborne exports by volume. The same report flags a key complication: Iran's earnings are opaque in part because barter and swap agreements distort straightforward cash-for-oil accounting. That opacity is not incidental. Western reporting over the last 2 years has described workarounds in which Iranian crude shipments translate into value delivered through intermediaries, payments to Chinese companies and contractors, or settlement channels designed to minimize sanctions exposure. We must be mindful of the numbers, but the scale can't be waved off. One media report suggests that China owed Iran up to $8.4 billion in unpaid oil proceeds at one point, with repayment routed through third-party arrangements rather than normal banking channels. Convert it into barrels, and you get a glimpse of the order of magnitude. Using EIA's 2024 Brent average of about $81 per BBL as a reference point, $8.4 billion equates to roughly 104 million barrels. If you assume discounted barrels, the implied range moves higher, closer to 125 to 140 million barrels. That's roughly 0.3 to 0.4 million barrels per day. However, that is not all Iranian exports to China, but it is large enough to function as a strategic throttle, a shadow settlement stream that can be tightened, redirected, or accelerated depending on Beijing's priorities. This is a mechanism Western audiences often miss. China does not need to take Tehran's side in public to keep the Islamic Republic on economic life support. It can do it by deciding which invoices to clear, studying the breach, and hardening the network. The other dynamic under Beijing's calming rhetoric is learning. After Israel's 2025 operations against Iran exposed how cyber vulnerabilities in modern states can aid target development and the disabling of critical systems, some analysts argue China is using Iran as a live-fire case study in what intelligence-led warfare looks like against a brittle security state. Beijing's response, accordingly, is less about speeches and more about infrastructure, pushing Iran toward ecosystems that are harder for Western and Israeli networks to exploit, and most importantly, easier for China to service. You can see it in navigation and communications. Iran's own communications ministry acknowledged deliberate GPS jamming after the war with Israel and said Tehran is exploring alternatives, such as China's Beidou, while warning senior officials against using apps like WhatsApp on security grounds. What is billed as resilience is dependence, moving a country's coordinates, logistics, and decision-making onto systems Beijing can influence. It is also obvious in security cooperation that stays below the threshold of an alliance. Reporting and analysis have pointed to Chinese support for Iran's air defense recovery after strikes, allegations Beijing can deny, Tehran can welcome, and Washington can struggle to interdict without escalating further. Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another example. It gives Beijing and Moscow a ready-made forum for security service coordination, counter-terrorism on paper, but increasingly useful for counter-sabotage learning, information sharing, and best practices among states that fear internal unrest as much as external attack. Russia's alignment, without the rescue. This is where Moscow enters the frame. Russia wants Iran in its anti-Western constellation, but it also has limited bandwidth and few incentives to fight Iran's battles. Russia is unlikely to put boots on the ground in Tehran. Recent language about constant analysis and corresponding actions suggests synchronization, not intervention, two powers watching the same crisis, sharing assessments, and calibrating moves that raise costs for Washington, without inheriting responsibility for Tehran's survival. Russian President Vladimir Putin wants his cake, but he's going to try to eat it, too. So the emerging architecture is not a mutual defense pact. It is a division of labor. Russia offers Iran hard-edged diplomatic cover and selective military technical help. China provides the economic oxygen and the technical backbone that helps the Iranian regime continue to operate. Beijing's real red line. Beijing's red line is disorder that spills into energy markets, threatens shipping, or produces an Iranian leadership that cannot keep oil flowing and promises kept. That is why Wang Yi can host the Organization of Islamic Cooperation meeting on January 26 and speak the language of unity while UN officials warn of killings, detentions, and communications blackouts inside Iran. These global positions are why the barter system matters as much as the diplomacy. If oil is the currency and Chinese contractors are the payees, then China does not need to send troops to shape outcomes. It can stabilize the Iranian regime's core functions, payroll, infrastructure, surveillance, navigation, while preserving deniability and avoiding a formal security guarantee. The result is a version of stabilization that looks calm on camera and coercive in the ledger, China as mediator in public, metronome in the background, keeping Iran just solvent enough, just connected enough, and just dependent enough to outlast the next wave. That is not peacekeeping. It is systems management. And in the Gulf, systems management may be the most consequential form of power on offer.